Tonight on Free Minds TV, crime-ridden Arkansas town to expand a 24-hour curfew. How a 24-hour curfew is even possible to be expanded? Well, we'll be getting into that. We're also going to be getting into the cost of the Iraq War, and as well as the downsizer dispatch and a whole lot more, all when we come back right here on Free Minds TV. And welcome to Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. With you, as always, is Toby.
And Nick.
So we're going to be talking about this article. Nick, you brought this article in today about a 24-hour curfew in an Arkansas town. I guess there's a lot of trouble going on there. They've got a 24-hour curfew going on. How that really works, I'm not really sure. I've heard of curfews for teens, say, at nighttime or past 10 o'clock to maybe 5 o'clock in the morning. How's a 24-hour curfew work in the first place? And then my second question is, how do you expand upon a curfew that's already going on for 24 hours? And my third question is, just to make sure, this is Arkansas in the United States, supposedly the freest country in the world, Nick?
Yeah.
All those, that's true?
This is out of Helena, West Helena in Arkansas. So it's only specifically this city, not the entire state of Arkansas. For the last week, they've been under a 24-hour curfew. Now, this doesn't mean you can't leave your home. It means that police are going to stop you if you leave your home at any point during the day and question you about why you're outside. If you don't have a good reason or you seem nervous in giving an answer, they're going to search you. So basically, they can search you if you're out on the streets simply because you're out on the streets. Young people are not allowed out at night, and adults are allowed out, but they still have to justify why they're on the street. And unfortunately, this was an emergency measure that the mayor had pushed through because this is a high-crime neighborhood. And what they did was put police officers on the streets with M16s and M4 assault rifles. It said that during the nighttime hours, they were actually equipped with night vision. So it's pretty akin to what you'd expect to see during a state of martial law, but these were regular police officers.
So is this constitutional, Nick? Can we do this in America? You can tell people that they have to stay inside, and if they come out, they're going to be questioned. Is that passes constitutional muster? How does this work? I thought that we lived in a free country where people can go from house to house as they please. How does the mayor justify doing this?
Well, the mayor has said that the citizens deserve peace, this is a direct quote, and that some infringement on constitutional rights is okay, and we have not violated anything as far as the Constitution.
Are there any lawsuits pending about this? Because I'm pretty sure that they have violated the Constitution, and they have done quite a bit that's wrong. Are there lawsuits pending? Are people doing something about this?
The American Civil Liberties Union of Arkansas is pursuing a lawsuit, or they're saying they're going to pursue a lawsuit, but the city council has voted 9-0, so unanimously voted to expand the curfew outside of this. It was a 10-block neighborhood that was originally under this curfew, so a fairly limited high-crime area of town. Now they've expanded it out so that the police can implement this curfew in any part of the city. So they've essentially said it's a great idea, and we're going to expand it. Now,
so that's what expanding the 24-hour curfew means, because I was a little bit confused with it. The title of your article says to expand a 24-hour curfew, so they're not thinking there's 25 hours in a day or something. Now it's just meaning greater neighborhood is going, the larger part of the neighborhood's going to be under this curfew?
Right. The entire city is going to be under this curfew. And it is a high-crime area. They're claiming this is working because they had 32 arrests since they began last week. Well, number one, they don't say how many arrests they had on a weekly basis before they essentially put this neighborhood under martial law. And many of the arrests, this particular article doesn't go into it, but I was reading some other versions of the story. Many of the arrests were either for simple drug possession or things like violations on driver's licenses. You have an expired driver's license and you're driving on it. And this isn't only people walking on the street. You can be stopped if you're driving in a car, riding on a bike. The act actually goes so far as to mention people on golf carts and horseback. So basically, if you're traveling from place to place in the city of Helena, West Helena, in Arkansas, you can be stopped whatsoever, and the police officers are going to be armed as if they're in a war zone.
So, I guess if you don't need to go too far to see something that might look like if you are in a war zone, if you are living in some place other than the United States, you just got to drive through, what is it, Helena, Arkansas, you said?
Yep.
And so if drivers are going through, say a tourist has to drive through there, someone getting to destination, can they be stopped too, or is this only for the townsfolk that live there, have to undergo this restrictive measures by the police?
The curfew is not. A curfew is generally in place for the city, not for specific individuals. So it's for anybody. If you're in the city and you're on the street, I mean, presumably the mayor or the city councilors, if they're out on the street, if a police officer doesn't recognize them, they can be stopped and searched for really no reason. It sounds, and the article's a little bit unclear, police have said they've not arrested anyone for violating the curfew, which to me implies that they at least think that they can arrest you simply for being on the street. They say they only question people and then give them special attention if their answers aren't satisfactory. But it sounds like the police in this town believe that they can arrest you simply for being on the street if they don't want you on the street.
Well, it sounds to me like if you are in this town and you care about freedom, it's time to get out. I mean, what are you waiting for? You're not allowed to go anywhere without pretty much asking the police permission. And I'd say if you're thinking about moving and you are someone who cares about liberty, cares about freedom, cares about your constitutional rights, maybe check out the Free State Project. We've got a ton of awesome Free Staters. While Nick and I are not Free Staters here in New Hampshire, a movement to get people to move to New Hampshire to make it a freer place. We do have a ton of Free Staters, everyone in the back who's helping out on the cameras, doing the floor, Lauren, who's awesome in the booth, all Free Staters working here to make this place a freer and better place, more freedoms, more liberties. If you're in a place that's a little too oppressive yourself, like such as this Arkansas town, check it out, Free State Project. It's something that I think is a pretty cool idea to get all the liberty activists together in order to protect our freedoms from those evil government goons who want to gobble them up. And speaking of evil government goons who want to gobble up your freedom, Nick, let's get into the Downsizer Dispatch, see what those fools in Washington are doing and what we need to nag them about.
Okay, well, there's a big subject right now is the moratorium on drilling offshore in U.S. waters. Now, this moratorium, what most people don't know, is that it actually expires every year unless Congress votes to renew it. So it sunsets every single year. Well, they always do pass the moratorium every year again, but they've never actually voted on offshore drilling since this ban was implemented. Every year it's attached to some other spending bill, and this isn't just for offshore drilling. What many people don't know is this is commonly done. Bills that, different subjects are rolled together in one bill, and you might have 500 different topics that should be addressed as separate pieces of legislation. They're instead rolled into one massive bill, and usually that bill is something like supplemental funding for the war, Social Security money, things that are politically
viable.
Right, they're very viable. Politicians don't want to vote against them. They understand that it wouldn't be popular or perceived as popular if they voted against them. And this is how a lot of bad legislation gets passed. The Real ID Act was never voted on by Congress. Your representatives or your elected officials never actually took a vote on whether or not to try to implement a national ID card. It was simply rolled in with Iraq war spending, and that's why a lot of senators and congressmen said they voted for it. New Hampshire's own Johnson Nunu says he opposes the Real ID program, but he still voted for it because it was part of funding for the Iraq war, and he wouldn't vote against that. So what Downsize DC has proposed to do to address this problem is pass a piece of legislation that they've essentially penned. They're getting it sponsored in Congress, and it would be called the One Subject at a Time Act. What it would do is it would force Congress to only make legislation that addresses relevant, something that is relevant to the title line. So if you pass, say, Iraq war spending, if that's the title of the bill, the body of the bill has to somewhat address the Iraq war and funding it.
Whoa, 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 whoa. You're talking about actually having the legislature vote on the bill that they're talking about, the one that's on the piece of paper, and not putting in all this other stuff into one bill. Make it one subject instead of 1,000. That's a little crazy. That's a little radical, Nick. I don't think this country's been operating under that assumption for many, many years. Do you think that we're ready to slow down making all these laws and make it a readable amount, something that there could actually be some real debate about instead of just passing them all? I don't know. That's a pretty big step, Nick.
Well, what Congress does is they pass laws that they can't possibly read. They pass more legislation every year than any of the congressmen could read. Even if that's all they did, they never took a break, never went home to see their families. All they did was read legislation and vote on it, didn't meet with constituents. They still couldn't possibly read all the legislation.
Let alone debate it.
Right. And you're expected by law to follow the laws they pass. So when they pass something like a drilling ban, that affects you, and it's going to affect all of us, but they never actually read it. They never read the language of the drilling ban because it was rolled in with something else. Or the Real ID Act. Now they're trying to push this down the throats of the states and the people to try to get a national ID database in place, and they never read it. But they expect us to have to live by it, and they're going to penalize states that don't comply. They never had time to read it. The Patriot Act was introduced, I believe there was about 48 or 24 hours, something like that, for Congress to read the legislation. It was something like 800 pages long. It was a very long piece of legislation. They simply couldn't read the bill, and that's done all the time.
Yeah, not to mention, if you've ever read legal language, it's very hard to interpret sometimes, and so it's not just speed reading. You can't speed read through this stuff. You need to be able to dissect it, figure out, see what the law is actually saying, because this legislation is written by lawyers, and it's very hard for the common folk to read, and it's insane that it's even allowed to be tacking on bill after bill after bill to different bills that have nothing to do with each other. And how it's legal right now, I don't know. It's probably not legal, but that never stopped Congress before. This bill just makes complete sense. One subject at a time. How can you go wrong? It's so easy to let your constituents know in Washington how you feel about that. DownsizeDC.org.
Yep, and they expect you to follow the laws that they pass, so they should at least read them before they mandate that it's something.
And this could slow it down, because right now, if you started reading the federal laws alone, not talking about state or local laws, just started today reading the federal laws. Let's say you're young. Well, Nick, you look pretty young. If you started right now, you would never finish by the time you died. That's pretty sad, isn't it? Even if you were reading for all the time.
Right, and well, that's assuming new legislation isn't passed,
Right.
which it will be. I mean, the number of laws we have on the books today could easily double in the next 20 years, unfortunately. So when people say that, well, this legislation and other pieces of legislation that Downsize DC puts forth would slow down the federal government, it would be much harder for them to pass laws, or the volume of laws that they pass, that's exactly the point.
That's good.
Yes. I mean, you could cut the size of the federal government in half, and I don't think, or the number of laws in half anyway, and I don't think most people would notice. I mean, there's 20,000 federal gun laws on the books, is my understanding. Cut it down to 10,000, I don't think people really are going to read the 10,000 either. So there's a lot of reduction we can do in Washington, D.C. as far as the size and scope of government goes. Yeah. And so that's exactly the point.
This is just some basic common sense. And if you disagree with us, though, we would love to hear from you. fmtv@freemindstv.com is the email address. fmtv@freemindstv.com is the email. Or you can leave us a message on our talkback line, 206-350-0123, 206-350-0123. I would love to hear from someone who disagrees with this legislation, because wow, you've got to be pretty out there, and it would be a pretty interesting message to hear from someone who thinks that we should be creating more and more and more of this completely bogus legislation in Washington. When we come back, we are going to be talking about more of the true cost of the Iraq War. We've talked a lot about how much the military spends. What about contractors? How much are we paying to rebuild the bridges that we're blowing up? Stay tuned. We'll be right back. This is Free Minds TV.
Am I on? Am I on?
You're on.
Do I talk now? Do I talk now? I'm Gardner Goldsmith,
I think
and
she's up by where they're doing the show.
you're watching Free Minds TV. Open your mind, baby. Tell others to do the same.
Free Minds TV is brought to you in part by Life Productions for your basic and semi-pro video production needs. From full wedding and event coverage to DVD authoring and distributions, lifeproductions.com. That's lyfproductions.com. And welcome back to Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. Once again, this is Toby.
And Nick.
All right, Nick, we've talked many times about how many billions of dollars we're squandering away in Iraq, giving it the money, like pretty much just throwing money down a rat hole, burning billions and billions and billions of dollars, a lot of it on credit, printing new money to fund this war that's been going on for many, many years. Since the invasion in 2003, we've been sending billions of dollars, paying for troops, paying for guns, paying for all this stuff to blow up Iraq, right?
Right.
So we've blown it up. Now what do? Well, you got to pay to rebuild it. We are spending billions of dollars to rebuild Iraq when we're the ones when we're blowing it up. We blow up a bridge and then we rebuild the bridge. Then we blow it up again. Then we rebuild it. So how much is the true cost of the Iraq war coming through? We hear all the time about how much is going to military spending. Military spending, that means it's going to armed forces. That doesn't start to factor in the paychecks for all the new materials that we're using to rebuild the bridges, as well as the hundreds of thousands, yes, hundreds of thousands of contractors that we have in Iraq, that Americans are paying private contractors in Iraq. And this is an article coming from the New York Times talking about how the cost of these contractors is going over $100 billion now. Over 100,000 people. I think it's 180,000. Yeah, 180,000 contractors, private contractors in Iraq, and they're using the word private a lot. While it is true that these are private contractors, it makes a lot of people think that, well, privatization is not necessarily so good. But I would like to point out that if this was a private war, well, we wouldn't be involved in it and we wouldn't have these contractors. So while these are private contractors being paid by the government, they're not really private because they wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the whole war that's not private in the first place.
Yeah, and it's not a marketplace function. That they're being paid with your tax dollars.
Right.
You don't have a choice whether you consider their services valuable or not. And I think most Americans would rather, if they were going to just donate money to rebuilding infrastructure, they'd rather do it here in the United States. I mean, we had a bridge collapse in Minnesota. I think it was about a year ago now, and our infrastructure is at a point where a lot of it's aging out. We're going to have to address a lot of things at home. Not to mention the economy's tight. A lot of people would like to pay bills with their own money. And so it's not true privatization when you have the government taking tax money and then giving it to corporations.
Right.
That's not what most advocates of a free market are talking about when they say
employer doesn't really make much difference. That's what's annoying me about this article that I was reading. Is its argument is not that we shouldn't be blowing up Iraq and then rebuilding it. And our opinion that we've given many times is we shouldn't have been in there in the first place and we should get out as quickly as possible. Apologies and all that stuff. I don't know why we're meddling in other countries' business. That aside, this article is arguing for that this shouldn't be privatized. We should just have more military today, though. What is interesting about this, though, is this is the first war we've been in where we actually are approaching the point or surpass the point where we actually have more private contractors on the ground than we actually have military personnel. So that's a new stepping point the U.S. has been in, and some of that does have to do with military contracts as well, Blackwater and stuff like that. We've been over those and why those are bad in the past as well. If you want to get in a little bit more on that, you can check out some of the archives that are up at freemindstv.com.
And what you're seeing, one of the reasons behind the fact that there aren't as many combat troops or Department of Defense personnel is that it's not a traditional war in the sense that there's not another nation's army on the other side. And to be honest, the combat isn't constant. A lot of
downtime.
Right, there's a lot of downtime. A lot of the casualties are caused by roadside bombs. It's, you can conduct sweeps, look for insurgents, but you're not in a constant state of fighting. So a lot of the work is rebuilding damage from the war previously and
blowing it up again.
Right, then somebody will blow it up, whether it's us or insurgents, and the American taxpayer is going to have to fix it. So
more of a mess and more reason it's time to just stay out of other countries' business. I like that motto. If you have a different opinion, though, please let us know. I'm sure some of you, most of you probably do. But let's move along to something else that's been a little bit controversial. Flying without ID. What do you think? Should people be able to get on an airplane if they don't have their driver's license or maybe a passport with them? Should they be able to just get on, kind of like you do a Greyhound bus, get on like you do get on the subway? Or should you have to be showing people your ID? Well, previously, the TSA didn't really mind if people flew without ID. Well, you'd go through the extra security, get patted down, go through, get some of your rights trampled on, but you could still fly without ID. Well, in June, they changed their mind and said people who are refusing to show their ID, well, they can't get on an airplane, and we're going to put them on a terrorist watch list. Well, now it looks like they're also going to be starting to do that with people who have acts stolen while at the airport. Those people are now also not going to be able to board planes and will also be put on that special terrorist watch list, particular watch list. Everywhere you go will be recorded. You'll go through the specialized screening every time you fly, and all your flight companions, well, the government will have them on file. What do you think, Nick?
Well, hopefully you don't lose your ID at another point during that 15-year period, or you'll never get off the list. We've already talked about how the terror watch list is already over 1 million names. Most of them are American citizens. You can actually, they don't like to say who's on the terror watch list. But
the database is too big to figure it out.
Right.
Pretty much over 1 million people are on it anyway.
I do know that the story broke that I know Senator Ted Kennedy and some other Congress people were actually on the terror watch list. If members of the federal government, of the legislature, can end up on the terror watch list, anybody can. I mean, it's not just for terrorists, and the list keeps expanding. It's not like they're narrowing it down and trying to get closer to finding the actual terrorists. They're just taking everybody for any possible reason that they can and putting them in the database. Why not just put all of us in the database, and then you're back to square one? There's no use in having a database of over 1 million potential terrorists, because that's too many names to go through. It doesn't provide useful information.
It is completely useless, but hey, what else is the government good for? Being useless. Lots of bean pushers over there in the TSA. People who probably should go back to their jobs at McDonald's.
Yeah, and it's not like you can appeal getting off.
I'm sorry, that might have been harsh. Not everyone at the TSA is a major buffoon, but let's face it. Have you been to the airport lately?
Well, I've flown lately, and some of them aren't the swiftest. But that aside, as far as the watch list goes, you can't get off it. I don't know that everyone understands that.
They don't even have a method for getting off it.
Sometimes it's hard to tell if you're on it until you start getting the special searches. But there's no real method to get yourself off or appeal and try to show, hey, I'm not a terrorist. And there's potential for abuse there. I mean, there's no reason that any administration couldn't put political opponents on there, people that they just didn't agree with because of policy issues. They can put you on the list, and it can really be a hassle for you if you're flying. Who knows how else it could be applied. So there is a potential for abuse there, for putting people on the list for reasons that have nothing to do with actually thinking they're terrorists.
Right. I mean, there's been... it's just completely insane. I agree with you, Nick, but I'm sure other people don't really agree with us. They think that this list is very important. You've got to do what you've got to do because security at all costs, right? And if we continue to put people on lists, well, we can really start doing something about it.
Well, the fact is that these steps really aren't all that effective. The TSA still misses a lot of the guns and bombs that their own red teams try to sneak through in drills. For a large part, it's just security theater. It's just a show to make people feel more safe. And to be honest, if you're weighing the risk of being killed in a terrorist attack against the risk of, say, dying of food poisoning, falling off a ladder, or dying in a car accident, terrorism is a pretty minor concern. Yeah. I mean, it's in the media all the time. Your odds of actually being killed or hurt by a terrorist, or having someone you know being killed or hurt by a terrorist, are so low that maybe you should just not worry about it. And
it's kind of like being worried about being hit by lightning during a thunderstorm if we didn't have any thunderstorms around here. I mean, we do have thunderstorms, so there is a slight chance of being hit by lightning. We don't have a lot of terrorists here. I think your chance of being killed by a terrorist in, let's just say where we're broadcasting from, Keene, New Hampshire, they're not very big.
No, and
I think it's close to 0%.
there have been studies done too that actually, not so much now, but shortly after 9/11, when they implemented the color-coded terror alert schemes, heart attack rates actually increased when they went up to the severe alert. People were worried about terrorism. People stressing out about terrorism has caused more fatalities if you go with the numbers of certain studies, and you could argue that they're not necessarily a sure thing. But I think the argument can be made that Americans worrying about terrorism has probably caused more deaths as a result of heart attacks and shortened more lives than terrorism is likely ever going to do.
Not to mention with our involvement in the whole war, our entire involvement in the Middle East, and the whole way America has seemed on a global scale. I mean, how much is tourism hurting us because, well, we're turning into a police state that thinks that we can control and run the entire world. Just one last thing I wanted to get on this article about is, this is talking about how you need to have your IDs. You need to have your ID to get on a plane. It should be noted that the terrorists who were involved in the attacks on 9/11 had proper identification.
There were one or two that had expired visas, but they did have the government paperwork.
They had the government paperwork that they're requesting to get on the plane. A terrorist isn't gonna not have an ID. I mean, if you have all this money behind you, chances are you're going to get a fake ID. I mean, it's not that impossible. The government is not foolproof, and they still have not made a foolproof ID. And you know what? They never will. It's scary, isn't it, Nick? But it's the truth. Well, we're running out of time. We have more articles we really want to get to, but we're going to have to save those for the good people here at Cheshire TV, where we broadcast from, as well as the member section. We're going to be getting into an article about poultry, a local article about selling poultry. Well, it's dangerous. We'll be telling you why. It's not quite as bad as terrorism, but it still makes those government folk nervous. We're also going to be getting into some talk about the conflict that's going on between Georgia and Russia, and a lot more. If you're watching on Cheshire TV, stay tuned for that segment, which will be running. If you're watching somewhere else, well, think about joining the member section. It's only $3 a month or $30 a year. Tons of bonus content. I think there's over 50 archives of the TV show, of the Free Minds Radio, and tons of bonus interviews, podcasts, and lots of stuff up there, all at the member site. Plus, it helps out the show. Well, it's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
Join us at Free Minds TV for archives, Free Minds Radio, and a whole lot more. Have a great night. So, yeah, looks good.